the man who conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and remade Rome itself, only to be stabbed 23 times by the senators he had pardoned. This is the true story of Julius Caesar. Chapter 1. Born into Turbulence. Rome, in the summer of 100 BC, was not a city at peace with itself. It was a city with its hands around its own throat. The streets were loud with it. The endless grinding argument between those who had everything and those who had nothing, between the old senatorial families who believed the republic was their personal inheritance and the common citizens who were beginning to suspect correctly that it was. Tribunes had been murdered in the Forum. Generals had marched armies home and refused to disband them. The whole magnificent machinery of Roman government, the elections, the debates, the ancient rituals, was starting to look less like a system of laws and more like an elaborate costume worn over something far more dangerous. Into this, on July 12, 100 BC, arrived Gaius Julius Caesar. He did not, of course, arrive with any fanfare he could appreciate. He arrived the way everyone does, screaming, furious at the cold, and entirely dependent on others to survive it. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was a praetor, respectable, connected, but not quite the first tier of Roman power. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, was by most ancient accounts a formidable woman, sharp-minded and disciplined, the kind of Roman matron who could make a household run and a son feel the full weight of her expectations simultaneously. The family belonged to the ancient patrician Julian clan, the gens Julia, whose lineage they traced, with tremendous confidence and a straight face, all the way back to the goddess Venus through her son Aeneas. If you were Roman, this was a serious claim. If you were anyone else, it was the most ambitious ancestry story ever told. Here is the small, wonderful contradiction at the heart of Caesar's origins. His family had Venus in their family tree, and their apartment was in the Suburra. The Suburra was not the kind of neighborhood you boasted about at dinner parties. Tucked in the low ground between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, it was Rome's loudest, densest, most unruly district, a compressed chaos of taverns, workshops, street vendors, noise, smell, and the kind of colorful human behavior that the upper-class Romans of the Palatine Hill preferred to pretend did not exist. It flooded regularly. It was, by the accounts of ancient writers, a place where a person could find anything they needed and lose anything they valued. The Julian family, divine descent and all, lived there, not in a villa, in a townhouse among the crowd. This mattered more than it might appear. A different child, born into that same family, might have spent his life gazing up at the Palatine Hill and dreaming of leaving the noise behind. Caesar seems to have absorbed it instead. He grew up surrounded by ordinary Romans, the tradesmen, the freedmen, the street-level voters, whose voices could be won or lost at the price of a good game or a generous gesture. He understood them not as an abstraction or a political category, but as neighbors, people he had heard arguing through the walls. Rome itself was the curriculum. The Forum was always within walking distance and always performing some new drama, a tribune's speech, a trial, a riot narrowly avoided or not avoided at all. The boy who would one day reshape Roman politics grew up watching what politics actually looked like at street level, which is to say, loud, personal, easily inflamed, and deeply dependent on whether the crowd liked you. The republic he was born into was already showing its age in the worst possible ways. The old arrangement, a careful balance of consuls, senators, and popular assemblies, designed to ensure no single man accumulated too much power, had been designed for a city-state governing itself. It had never been fully redesigned for an empire that now stretched across the Mediterranean. The institutions were the same. The pressures on them were enormous and growing. It was like watching a boat that had been built for a lake being asked to cross an ocean. It wasn't sinking yet, but you could hear it creak. The year of Caesar's birth was itself a small proof of the tension. His relative by marriage, the general Gaius Marius, had already held the consulship in defiance of traditional rules, dragging his popularity with the common people like a shield against the Senate's displeasure. The populares, the political faction that claimed to speak for ordinary Romans, and the optimates, the faction that spoke for senatorial tradition and rather more reliably for senatorial interests, were locked in a struggle that was moving steadily from words toward blood. Within a decade, it would produce actual armies marching on Rome. Within 2 decades, Sulla would become dictator and proscription lists would appear in the Forum. Names of men to be killed, their property claimed, their families left to manage the wreckage. Caesar was a child for all of this, and then a teenager. He was watching. His education was the traditional elite Roman kind: rhetoric, literature, philosophy, Greek, the elaborate art of speaking persuasively in public. But his education also included looking out a window in the Suburra and understanding what kind of city actually existed below the elegant speeches. He learned both, and the combination would prove to be almost unfair in its usefulness. There is something almost quietly poignant in picturing him as a small boy in that loud neighborhood, in a family that had divine pretensions and everyday rent to pay, in a republic that was philosophically committed to the idea that no one should be too powerful and practically incapable of stopping anyone ambitious enough to try. He was not yet anything. He was just a child with an extraordinary name in an ordinary street in a city that was, without quite knowing it, preparing to tear itself apart. Rome had built itself on contradiction: liberty and slavery, tradition and violence, the rule of law and the rule of whoever held the sword. And it had handed those contradictions to a boy with the patience to study them and the ambition to one day use everything he learned. The city was his first and greatest teacher, and it taught him everything. Chapter 2. The Dictator's Shadow. The dictator's shadow, Sulla, was not a man who expected to be told no. By the time Caesar was a teenager, the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla had already marched his legions on Rome twice, had watched rivers of political blood run through the city's streets, and had personally signed off on proscription lists that sentenced thousands of men to death. He ran Rome not through persuasion, but through the sheer, suffocating weight of what he was capable of. When Sulla asked a young nobleman to do something, it was understood, deeply and instinctively, that the word asked was doing a great deal of work. What he asked of Caesar was simple enough on the surface: divorce Cornelia. Caesar had married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a man who had been Sulla's most bitter enemy. Cinna was dead now, which was convenient for Sulla, but his daughter was still married to a Julian boy who carried the political associations of the wrong family tree. Sulla had been making a habit of forcing his opponent's relatives to sever ties, to publicly untangle themselves from the losing side. It was a reasonable demand, strategically speaking. It cost Caesar nothing material. It was, by the standards of Roman political survival, a small price. Caesar said no. The sheer audacity of this is difficult to overstate. Caesar was, at this point, barely out of adolescence. He had no legions. He had no real wealth. He had charm and a famous family name and a young wife he had married for love as much as politics, and he stood in front of the machinery of a dictatorship and said, in effect, that he would not be doing that. Sulla was reportedly furious, which was not a pleasant condition for those in the vicinity. Cornelia was stripped of her dowry. Caesar's inheritance through his family connections to Marius, Sulla's old nemesis, was confiscated as well. These were warnings, the ancient equivalent of a knock on the door in the middle of the night. The message was clear: bend, or face what comes next. Caesar didn't bend. He ran. He fled into the hills of Sabinum, the rugged, uneven countryside northeast of Rome, where a young man with enemies and no army had about the same life expectancy as a rumor. Sulla's soldiers were actively hunting him. This was not a metaphor or a political inconvenience. Men with swords were looking for him in the hills, and they were not looking for him to have a conversation. Caesar moved frequently, hiding in farmhouses and rough shelters, occasionally falling ill with the malarial fever that stalked anyone unwise enough to spend too long in certain stretches of the Italian countryside. He would have been young, feverish, hiding in the dark, listening for the sounds of soldiers on the road. Whatever iron was forming inside him, it was being forged in genuinely miserable conditions. The soldiers found him at least once. Ancient accounts describe a close encounter where Caesar talked his way through a patrol, or bribed them, or possibly both. The details are fuzzy, as details from desperate hillside negotiations tend to be. What is clear is that he survived it, which was the whole point. Back in Rome, people with more standing than a teenager on the run were working on his behalf. Caesar's family still had connections, and the Vestal Virgins, those formidably respected women whose intercessions carried real weight in Roman religious and political life, added their voices to the appeals for clemency. It took time, and it presumably took a great deal of anxious waiting from those involved, but eventually Sulla agreed to grant a pardon. He didn't do it graciously. According to the accounts that survived, Sulla gave Caesar his life back but couldn't quite resist one final observation. He warned those around him, possibly with genuine unease beneath the irritation, that the young man they were asking him to spare was dangerous, that in Caesar there were many Mariuses waiting. Marius had been the great populist general, the man from the wrong class who had remade the Roman army and terrified the aristocracy with his ambitions and his power. Sulla had built his entire career in opposition to what Marius represented, and here he was, looking at a teenager who had refused a direct order, survived a manhunt, and charmed the Vestal Virgins into lobbying for his life, and seeing the same shape of trouble in a younger face. It was, in its backhanded way, the most magnificent compliment Caesar ever received, and he hadn't even done anything yet. What this episode reveals about the man Caesar was becoming is interesting precisely because it doesn't fit the clean, heroic version. He ran, he hid, he got sick in the hills, he needed other people to save him. None of that is the biography of someone who never felt fear or doubt. What sets it apart is the thing that came before all of that, the refusal. He made the choice that started the whole chase, knowing what it might cost, and he made it anyway. Whether that was courage or stubbornness or some particular Roman understanding of dignity that made certain surrenders feel worse than death, is probably a question Caesar himself couldn't have fully answered. He was pardoned. He went home to Cornelia. Sulla died a year or two later, which had the effect of making Caesar's defiance look slightly less insane in retrospect. But no one could have known that while Caesar was hiding in Sabinum, feverish and hunted, holding on to a marriage and a refusal that might easily have gotten him killed, he held on anyway. The young man who walked back into Rome after his pardon was different from the one who had fled it, not because the danger had broken something in him, but because surviving it had confirmed something. He now knew, at a level that no education or family name could teach, that he could make a terrible choice under pressure and live with it. That knowledge, the bone-deep understanding that he would not fold when it mattered, was perhaps the most important thing Sulla ever gave him, entirely against his intentions. Rome would encounter that stubbornness again many times, at much higher stakes, with much larger consequences for everyone involved. Chapter 3. Captured by Pirates. The pirates didn't know what they had caught. That much became clear almost immediately. Most captives, when hauled aboard a Cilician raiding vessel somewhere in the Aegean, did the sensible thing. They went pale, they went quiet. They tried very hard to be invisible. Gaius Julius Caesar, 25 years old, somewhere between a promising young aristocrat and a man with more enemies than assets, did none of these things. He looked around at his captors, took stock of the situation, and then, by all accounts, seemed mildly annoyed. Not frightened, not shattered, the way a man gets when his travel plans have been inconveniently disrupted. He had been sailing for Rhodes, where he intended to study rhetoric under the celebrated teacher Apollonius Milon. Rhetoric mattered enormously in Rome. The ability to stand before the Senate or a crowd and move them, to shape language into something that cut or seduced or convinced, was not merely decoration. It was power made audible. Caesar understood this with the same clarity he understood most things, and so he had set sail, and so he had been boarded. The ransom demand the pirates settled on was 20 talents of silver. It was not a small sum. For most captives it would have felt like a verdict, a number to stare at in the dark while hoping distant relatives scraped enough together before patience ran out. Caesar laughed at them, not nervously, not diplomatically. He laughed the way someone laughs at an absurd underestimate, which is exactly what he told them it was. 20 talents? He was Caesar. Did they have any idea who they were dealing with? He informed them with complete apparent sincerity that he was worth at least 50 talents, and that demanding 20 was frankly a little insulting. He urged them to think bigger. The pirates, to their eternal misfortune, found this charming. They sent his companions ashore to gather the revised ransom and settled in to wait. What followed was one of the stranger interludes in the ancient world. Caesar was a prisoner only in the most technical sense. He slept when he chose and ordered the pirates to keep quiet when he didn't feel like being disturbed. He composed poetry aboard the ship and read it aloud to his captors, and when they didn't respond with the enthusiasm he thought the work deserved, he told them flatly that they were barbarians with no literary taste. They laughed at this. He was probably not joking. He exercised daily on the deck, organized games, and threw himself into the routines of a man on a particularly inconvenient holiday rather than a man whose life was balanced on whether a ransom arrived in time. He ate with the pirates, argued with them, occasionally bossed them around with such natural authority that some of them apparently started to listen. And then, at quiet moments between all the poetry and the games and the cheerful insults, he would look at them and say it. When he was free, he would come back and he would crucify every last one of them. The pirates thought this was hilarious. The little aristocrat with his expensive vows and his bruised dignity making theatrical promises of revenge. What a character. They liked him, which made the whole thing worse in retrospect. He wasn't joking about that either. The 50 talents arrived after roughly 38 days. The transaction was completed, Caesar was released, and most people in that situation would have sailed onto Rhodes and tried to forget the whole miserable business. Caesar sailed to Miletus instead, went directly to the harbor authorities and explained that he needed ships. He was going back. He got them. He raised a small fleet, turned around, and sailed to the island where the pirates had made camp. They were still there? Perhaps they thought the whole crucifixion business had been a joke. Perhaps they thought he would let it go. They were wrong on both counts. Caesar captured nearly all of them and had them imprisoned while he requested that the regional governor handle formal sentencing. The governor hesitated. There were questions of jurisdiction, of politics, of inconvenience. Caesar, who had very little patience for administrative delay when he had made up his mind, didn't wait. He went back to the prison himself, and he had them crucified, everyone as he had promised, on the beach. There is a detail that has survived from this moment, something that complicates the clean cruelty of it. Caesar, perhaps because he had spent 5 weeks eating with these men, or reading them his poetry, or something less easy to name, ordered that their throats be cut before they were raised on the crosses so that they would not suffer as long. It was, in its way, a mercy. Small, particular, decided entirely by him, but a mercy. It didn't make the crucifixions less of what they were, but it said something about the man doing them, that he could hold both the iron and something else side by side without either one canceling the other out. He sailed for Rhodes afterward. He studied his rhetoric. Life resumed. But the pirate episode had revealed something that all the political maneuvering and family pedigree couldn't quite demonstrate on its own. This was a man who laughed at his own ransom, who composed verse in captivity and complained about the audience, who made a promise that any reasonable person would have dismissed as theater and then kept it with a fleet and a carpenter's nails. He was not simply ambitious. He was something else. A man for whom the gap between what he said and what he did was genuinely, almost frighteningly small. He meant things. That quality, rare and dangerous, would follow him for the rest of his life, as a gift and eventually as a kind of doom. For now, though, Rome was still a long sail away, and Caesar had grammar to master, and somewhere on a beach in the Aegean, the Gauls were doing what Gauls do, indifferent to history. Chapter 4. The Ladder of Power. The ladder of power debt in Rome was not merely a financial condition, it was a political instrument, a social signal, and for the right man, a weapon. Caesar understood this earlier than almost anyone, and he wielded it with the cheerful recklessness of someone who had decided that the only way out of debt was through it. By the time he reached his early 30s, Caesar owed sums that would have ruined lesser men entirely. He didn't slow down. He accelerated. His first significant rung on the ladder was the quaestorship, the entry-level magistracy that sent him to the province of Further Spain in 69 BC. The posting was administrative, unglamorous, meant to season young men with paperwork and provincial dullness. Caesar took the assignment, did competent work, and then reportedly stood before a statue of Alexander the Great in a temple at Gades and wept, not from grief exactly, but from something sharper. The recognition that Alexander, at Caesar's current age, had already conquered the known world, while Caesar was still auditing grain records. It was the kind of moment a man keeps to himself. Caesar apparently did not keep it entirely to himself, which tells you something about how carefully he managed even his private mythology. He returned to Rome with renewed urgency. The aedileship came next, and this was where Caesar stopped being merely promising and became genuinely dangerous. The aediles were responsible for public buildings, markets, and most critically, public games. Games were not entertainment in the modern casual sense. They were the beating pulse of Roman political life. A man who gave Rome spectacular games gave Rome something it could not ignore and could not easily forget. Caesar gave Rome spectacular games. He flooded the forum with gladiatorial combat on a scale that left audiences breathless and rival politicians quietly panicked. He restored and decorated public monuments with a lavishness that made the city look like he had personally gifted it a new wardrobe. He organized theatrical performances, wild beast hunts, elaborate processions. The crowds adored him. The Senate, watching the bill climb, was less delighted. But they weren't the ones he was buying. The money for all of this came from Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, possibly the richest man Rome had ever produced. Crassus had made his fortune through real estate, silver mines, and a peculiar business model involving Rome's notoriously frequent fires. He owned a private fire brigade that would arrive at a burning building and negotiate a purchase price before dousing the flames. Whatever his methods, his wealth was staggering, and he saw in Caesar something worth investing in, raw political talent that needed only fuel to ignite. Crassus provided the fuel. Caesar provided the fire. The office Caesar wanted next, truly wanted with the full force of his ambition, was Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. It was a lifetime appointment, one of the most prestigious positions in the Republic, and in 63 BC it was occupied by a man who had held it for decades. Caesar decided he would simply take it. He borrowed enormous additional sums and distributed them with cheerful directness to voters and tribal leaders who had any influence over the election. The bribery was so brazen, so operatic in its scale, that even Romans, people not easily shocked by political corruption, found it remarkable. On the morning of the election, Caesar reportedly told his mother, as she saw him off at the door, that he would return as Pontifex Maximus or not return at all, meaning he would exile himself rather than face the debts and disgrace of defeat. It was a rare, unguarded admission, the mask slipping just slightly to show the pressure behind it. He won by a commanding margin. The office came with an official residence, the Domus Publica in the Roman Forum, which solved at least one of Caesar's more pressing logistical problems. He moved in, settled his household, and continued accumulating power with the focused calm of a man who had decided that the Republic's rules were more like suggestions, elaborate, ancient suggestions, but suggestions nonetheless. And then came the arrangement that would put the entire machine in his hands. In 60 BC, Caesar returned from a governorship in Spain with genuine military accomplishments, enough to qualify for a triumph, Rome's celebrated victory parade. But claiming the triumph required waiting outside the city walls while the Senate deliberated, and waiting outside the city meant he couldn't formally stand for the consulship, Rome's highest elected office, without physically entering and registering. He asked the Senate for a special exemption to stand for consul, while still technically outside the city awaiting his triumph. The Senate refused. Caesar walked into Rome without a second's hesitation, abandoned the triumph entirely, and registered for the consulship. A triumph was theater. The consulship was power. He knew the difference. To win it, he needed more than money. He needed allies. He approached Pompey, the celebrated general who had conquered the East and returned to Rome only to find the Senate blocking his veteran land settlement bills out of sheer institutional stubbornness. He approached Crassus, who had his own unresolved grievances with the Senate over tax contracts in Asia. Three men with different needs and one overlapping interest, the Senate's obstruction was bad for all of them. What emerged was not a formal institution, had no official name at the time, and left no written charter. Later historians would call it the First Triumvirate. At the time, it was simply a private understanding among three powerful men that they would coordinate their resources: Pompey's military prestige and veteran legions, Crassus's incomprehensible wealth, and Caesar's political genius and popular following to ensure that Rome's machinery worked for them rather than against them. Caesar won the consulship of 59 BC. He then proceeded to push through Pompey's land reforms, Crassus's tax relief, and his own agenda with a bluntness that scandalized the traditionalists and a speed that left opponents scrambling. When his fellow consul tried to obstruct him through religious technicalities, Caesar had him physically removed from the proceedings. When a senator began a filibuster, Caesar had him arrested. The old republican courtesies, the elaborate deference to procedure and precedent, dissolved like morning frost. Things got done. What Caesar had built, through borrowed gold, spectacular theater, relentless charm, and calculated alliance, was something Rome had never quite seen before: a private power structure that wore the Republic's face while operating entirely on its own terms. The Senate still met, elections still occurred, the forms were observed, but the substance had shifted, quietly and permanently, into the hands of three men who had decided they no longer needed to ask permission. Caesar, personally, had started the decade nearly destroyed by debt and ended it as one of the three men who effectively ran the Roman world, all without ever once appearing to strain from the effort. Chapter 5. The Gallic Wars. 8 years. That's how long it took Caesar to turn a province into a legend, a general into a god, and Gaul into a graveyard. He arrived in 58 BC with a proconsular command, legal authority over a stretch of northern territory, and the kind of political debt that would crush a lesser man. Rome's creditors were circling, his enemies in the Senate were sharpening their rhetoric. What Caesar needed, urgently and desperately, was something only a war could provide: money, glory, and enough distance from Rome to let his enemies tire of waiting for him. Gaul provided all three, though the cost would be measured in blood on a scale that still staggers the imagination. The campaign began almost accidentally, as the best ones do. A tribe called the Helvetii announced they were migrating through Roman-protected territory, and Caesar announced that they were not. He blocked their path, fought them, defeated them, and sent them home. Just like that, Rome's borders had a new champion, and Caesar had his first victory dispatch racing south toward an adoring public. He had a gift for framing, an instinct for which details to highlight and which to let fall quietly into the ditch. His written account of the wars, the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, was essentially military journalism written by the journalist's most interested subject. He referred to himself throughout in the third person: Caesar did this, Caesar ordered that, with the serene confidence of a man who understood that distance creates authority. It worked magnificently, but Gaul was not simply a stage for his literary ambitions. It was a vast, violent, complicated world of competing tribes, ancient grudges, and warriors who had never had any particular reason to fear Rome. Caesar learned this fast. He spent 8 years fighting more than 50 engagements, each one a problem to be solved under conditions that ranged from difficult to nearly fatal. His legions built siege works in days that modern engineers would spend months on. When the Germanic chieftain Ariovistus threatened from the east, Caesar marched to meet him before his own nervous officers had finished trembling. He reportedly read the fear in his command staff's faces, stood before them and said, with perfect calm, that if no one else would march, he would go with just the 10th Legion, whom he trusted. The rest of the army, stung and sheepish, fell into line behind him. There were moments, quieter ones, that his own dispatches glossed over, but history preserved in fragments. The winters in Gaul were long and grinding. Supply lines broke. Tribes that had pledged loyalty unpleased at the moment Caesar's back was turned. He was managing a theater of war that stretched in every direction at once, and doing it with an army that, however skilled, was made of men who bled and froze and grew tired. Caesar understood them with the practical intimacy of a commander who had learned early that soldiers follow the leader who suffers alongside them, or at least makes them believe he does. Then there was the Rhine. In 55 BC, Caesar decided that the Germanic tribes across the river needed to understand, viscerally and permanently, that Rome could go anywhere it chose. He built a bridge across the Rhine, not by boat, not by raft, but an actual timber bridge, engineered and constructed in 10 days. He marched his army across, spent 18 days demonstrating Roman reach to suitably alarmed Germanic villages, then marched back and dismantled the bridge behind him. The whole exercise was, in practical military terms, nearly pointless. In psychological and political terms, it was perfect. The message was not, "We conquered you." The message was, "We could." Caesar knew the difference, and he knew which one Rome would cheer louder. Britain followed, twice. The island sat at the edge of the known world, wrapped in myth and sea mist, and Caesar sailed for it in 55 and again in 54 BC, with the cheerful audacity of a man who considered geographical limits more of a suggestion than a rule. The British campaigns were not exactly triumphant. The tides were uncooperative, the natives fought in chariots and vanished into forests, and neither expedition produced lasting conquest. But Caesar wrote about them with such vivid flair that Rome didn't notice the strategic ambiguity. He had gone to the edge of the world. He had come back. That was enough. The darkest chapter of the Gallic Wars came between 52 BC, when a chieftain named Vercingetorix did what no Gaul before him had managed. He united the tribes. He was young, charismatic, and strategically shrewd, and he understood that Rome's greatest vulnerability was its supply chain. His strategy was to burn Gallic towns and crops before Caesar could use them, starving the legions out rather than fighting them head-on. It nearly worked. Caesar's army marched through a scorched landscape, hungry and stretched thin, and for a moment the whole enterprise teetered. The showdown came at Alesia, a hilltop fortress where Vercingetorix had retreated with 80,000 warriors. Caesar did something that should not have been possible. He built a wall around the entire fortress to trap the army inside, then built a second wall facing outward to hold off the relief army coming from behind. His legions were, for a period, sandwiched between two Gallic forces, fighting in both directions simultaneously. The battle was savage, and there were hours when the outcome genuinely was not clear. Then Caesar himself rode to a threatened section of the outer wall, his red cloak visible to every man on the field, not because he was reckless, but because he understood that a commander seen is a commander obeyed, and the line held. Vercingetorix surrendered the next day, riding out of Alesia on a magnificent horse and laying his weapons at Caesar's feet. He would spend years in a Roman prison before being executed at Caesar's triumph. The numbers attached to the Gallic Wars are hard to hold in the mind without flinching. 1 million dead, another million enslaved, entire peoples reduced, entire cultures shattered. Even in Rome, voices rose in protest. The senator Cato called for Caesar to be handed over to the Gauls in atonement. Caesar's own dispatches recorded the massacres with the same clean, elegant prose he used to describe bridge construction. Whether that detachment was genuine or performed, history cannot say with certainty. What it can say is that Caesar never expressed regret, and Rome never demanded it. What he sent home instead were his commentariae, those cool, precise, beautifully crafted reports that Romans devoured like novels. He was building something in those pages as deliberately as he built siege works, a version of himself that was invincible, merciful where possible, inevitable always. By the time he marched out of Gaul in 50 BC, the campaign had made him the most famous man in the Roman world, richer than most of his rivals, beloved by an army that would follow him anywhere, and profoundly, irreversibly dangerous to those who had hoped distance would make him irrelevant. The 8 years in Gaul had not softened him. They had finished him, tempered and sharpened him into precisely the instrument that the next crisis would require. Chapter 6. Crossing the Rubicon. The letter arrived too late, or perhaps exactly on time, depending on how history chooses to read it. In early January 49 BC, the Roman Senate passed its ultimate emergency decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, effectively stripping Caesar of his command and ordering him to disband his legions or be declared an enemy of the state. His enemies in Rome, Pompey chief among them, had spent years engineering precisely this moment. Caesar had asked for something reasonable, or so he believed. Allow him to stand for the consulship in absentia, let him keep his army until the election, and no one needed to do anything dramatic. The Senate, pushed hard by men who had decided Caesar was more dangerous as a politician than as a general, said no. Then they said it again with a legal decree that carried the weight of a death sentence attached. So there he stood. The Rubicon was not by any measure an impressive river. It was narrow, cold in January, and unremarkable in every physical sense, the kind of river a traveler crosses without remembering having done so. What made it monstrous was the law. Roman law forbade any general from crossing the Rubicon with an army intact. That invisible line, that thin ribbon of freezing water, was the boundary between the provinces and Italy proper, and between military command and civilian authority. Cross it armed, and you were not a general returning home. You were an invader. You were a traitor. Caesar had the 13th Legion with him. Veterans, men who had marched through rain and mud in Gaul for years, who had stormed fortifications that should not have been stormable, who had faced enemies that outnumbered them and won through discipline and trust in the man giving the orders. They would go where Caesar went. That was not in question. What was in question was whether Caesar would go at all. Ancient sources paint this moment in different lights. Some say he deliberated through the night. Others say he wavered visibly, pacing, uncharacteristically quiet. Suetonius records that he turned to his companions and reminded them how easy it was still to turn back, and how, once that step was taken, there would be no turning back at all. For a man who rarely admitted to doubt in public, this was something. The political math was not complicated. If he disbanded the army and walked into Rome as a private citizen, his enemies would prosecute him. The charges would be convenient fictions dressed up in legal language, but the result would be real: exile, disgrace, the end of everything. If he crossed, he would be fighting the Roman Republic itself, the institution he had served, the system whose rules he had bent and gamed and maneuvered through for decades, but had never technically broken beyond repair, until now. He was 50 years old. He had spent half his life accumulating exactly this kind of power, and the Senate was asking him to hand it over and wait politely for the blade. He crossed. The exact words he said at the Rubicon depend on which ancient source you trust, but the phrase that history locked onto, "the die is cast," carries the ring of a man who has made peace with an enormous gamble. Iacta alea estimated, in Greek, some sources say, because Caesar was fond of Greek, and perhaps because the language felt more theatrical, more fitting for the moment a man decides to bet everything. The die is cast. Not "I have decided" or "we march," but a gambling metaphor, the acknowledgement that the outcome was now to some degree out of his hands. What followed was almost absurd in how smoothly it went. Caesar moved south with speed that left no time for organized resistance. Town after town simply opened its gates. Ariminum fell without a fight. Local garrisons looked at the approaching legions and made rapid calculations about their own futures. Pompey, for all his celebrated military reputation, had not prepared for an assault this fast, and the troops he had available in Italy were raw and untested, nothing like Caesar's hardened men. The Senate panicked spectacularly. Senators who had spent months grandstanding about defending the Republic packed their valuables and left Rome in a frantic, undignified rush. Pompey himself, Pompey the Great, the man who had once cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 3 months flat, the celebrated conqueror of the East, fled to Brundicum in the south, and then across the Adriatic to Greece. Rome, the eternal city, the city that had resisted Hannibal, that had rebuilt itself after Gauls burned it to the ground, emptied out like a house whose owner smelled smoke. Caesar entered Rome without drawing a sword. There is something both triumphant and quietly devastating about that fact. He had crossed the Rubicon expecting war, and what he found instead was an abandoned stage. The Senate house was half empty. The treasury was still there. Pompey's men had fled so fast they failed to take it, and Caesar, ever practical, helped himself. He was not a king. He was very insistent about that. He had crossed the river to protect his dignity and his rights, and anyone who wanted to come back and discuss the matter rationally was welcome to do so. No one came back. The republic he had served had chosen flight over confrontation, and in doing so had handed him something no battle could have given cleanly: legitimacy by default. His soldiers, who had spent years being told they were fighting for Rome, found themselves camped inside it without having had to fight at all. Caesar reportedly moved fast to calm the city, reassure its citizens, restore order. He was deliberate about the image he projected. This was not conquest. This was correction. Whether he believed that is a question history cannot fully answer. What it can answer is what he did next, which was everything, relentlessly, in the years that followed. But for that single January night in 49 BC, when the die left his hand and arced over the narrow, cold water of the Rubicon, there was just a man at a river's edge, choosing the future over the past and hoping, probably, that the future would be kind enough to justify it. It would be many things. Kind was not always among them. Chapter 7. Caesar and Cleopatra. The gift arrived wrapped in linen and soaked in brine. Ptolemy XIII, boy king of Egypt, had done what he believed was a tremendous favor for the most powerful man in the world. He had arranged the murder of Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Caesar's great rival, the man whose armies had just been shattered at Pharsalus. And as Caesar's ship entered the harbor of Alexandria in the autumn of 48 BC, one of Ptolemy's courtiers climbed aboard holding a wooden chest and wearing the expression of someone expecting a reward. Inside the chest was Pompey's head. Caesar looked at it, then Julius Caesar, who had spent the better part of a decade trying to defeat this man, who had crossed a river and ignited a civil war in part because of him, wept. Not performed grief, not diplomatic theater, but something genuine and rattled loose from somewhere he hadn't expected. This was the man who had once been his partner, his ally, the co-architect of an arrangement that had remade Roman politics. They had been bound together by Caesar's daughter Julia, who had loved Pompey, and who had died in childbirth years before, taking with her whatever warmth had once existed between them. And now here was what was left of him, in a box, in Egypt, presented like a trophy by a child king who understood nothing about what he was looking at. Caesar dismissed the courtier. He ordered Pompey's head buried with honors. The welcome to Alexandria had already announced itself as complicated. What Caesar walked into was a city in the middle of a royal civil war. Ptolemy XIII, perhaps 15 years old and entirely managed by his advisors, had recently driven his older sister Cleopatra VII out of the palace and out of the co-regency they were supposed to share. Cleopatra had retreated to the eastern frontier, raising an army waiting. She was 21 years old, fluent in 9 languages, including Egyptian, which none of her Ptolemaic ancestors had ever bothered to learn, and she had not the slightest intention of losing. When she heard Caesar was in Alexandria, she understood immediately what he represented. A Roman general with an army, a man who could tip the scales, a man who needed to be reached before her brother's people could frame the narrative against her. So she did what she did. The exact details have been softened by centuries of retelling into something romantic and tidy, but the mechanics of it were really more like an extremely high-stakes smuggling operation. Cleopatra had herself wrapped inside a large sack, or perhaps a rolled carpet, depending on the source, and had one of her loyal servants carry the bundle through the palace and into Caesar's private chambers. When the bundle was unrolled and Cleopatra stood up in front of him, disheveled, brilliant, utterly composed, Caesar was reportedly delighted. Whatever he had been expecting from his evening in Alexandria, it was not this. By morning they were allied. Within weeks, by most accounts, they were something considerably more than that. What followed was the Alexandrian War, a chaotic months-long siege in which Caesar found himself badly outnumbered, bottled into the royal palace quarter with a few thousand troops while Ptolemy's forces controlled the city. At one point, Caesar was forced to swim for his life from a burning pier, famously holding documents above the water with one hand. The Great Library of Alexandria suffered fire damage during the conflict, a loss that still aches across the centuries. Caesar, for his part, seemed to treat the whole thing with the same unsettling calm he brought to every military crisis, improvising, adapting, waiting for reinforcements that eventually arrived from the east. He was 53 years old and swimming away from burning ships in a foreign harbor. The republic he had spent his life climbing was already behind him. He had nowhere to go but forward. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during the fighting, weighted down by armor, fleeing a battle he had lost. Caesar installed Cleopatra as sole ruler of Egypt alongside a younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was in every meaningful sense a figurehead. The war resolved. Caesar did not leave. He stayed for months. He and Cleopatra traveled together up the Nile on a magnificent royal barge, a journey that was equal parts political theater and something harder to categorize. Egypt was not Rome. It operated by entirely different logic, ancient logic, the kind that stretched back 3,000 years before anyone had heard of the Tiber River. Here the ruler was not merely powerful. The ruler was divine. Pharaohs were gods made flesh, intermediaries between the human world and forces far larger than Senate votes or popular assemblies. Caesar, who had grown up in the careful republican fiction that all power was shared, collective, temporarily delegated, was watching a different system function with absolute self-assurance. The temples, the priests, the crowds who prostrated themselves, the idea that one person could simply be by nature and by right above all others. It is not hard to imagine what a man like Caesar was thinking. Cleopatra bore him a son. The Egyptians called the boy Ptolemy Caesarion, Little Caesar, and in Alexandria he was displayed as the legitimate heir of two great dynasties, proof of divine alignment made human. Caesar never formally acknowledged Caesarion as his son in Rome, where such a thing would have been legally and politically impossible, but he allowed a golden statue of Cleopatra to stand in the temple of Venus Genetrix back in the capital, a gesture whose meaning no Roman could mistake. This was not a casual arrangement. What Caesar carried back to Rome from Egypt was not just military victory or exotic memories. It was a framework, a vision of concentrated, sacral, permanent authority that Rome had never possessed and the republican tradition had always denied. The ancient Ptolemaic world had shown him not just what power could look like, but what it could feel like, to be regarded not as a temporarily empowered magistrate, but as something closer to the eternal. Whether that vision was a gift or a poison would depend entirely on who was doing the measuring. Caesar finally left Egypt in the summer of 47 BC, heading east to deal with a new military emergency, moving with characteristic speed toward the next problem, the next campaign, the next transformation. But Alexandria had left its mark on him the way deep water leaves a mark, not visibly, not immediately, but in the way a man stands afterward, in what he no longer finds it possible to pretend. Chapter 8. Dictator Perpetuo. Power, when it finally arrives in full, rarely announces itself with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives as a title scrawled on a document, passed through the hands of nervous clerks, ratified by men who already sense they have made a catastrophic mistake. In 44 BC, the Roman Senate granted Gaius Julius Caesar the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, not for 6 months, not for a crisis, not until the emergency passed, forever. It was, constitutionally speaking, a word that had no business being attached to another word like perpetuo, because the entire point of a Roman dictator was that the office expired. That was the safety valve. That was the thing that made it tolerable. Rome had removed the safety valve, handed Caesar the machine, and then looked around nervously wondering why the room felt so hot. Caesar accepted. He was not a man inclined toward false modesty at this stage of his life. He had spent decades clawing, spending, fighting, and outwitting his way to the summit of Roman politics. He had crossed a river with an army and watched a republic flinch. False modesty would have been insulting to everyone involved, and Caesar had always preferred honesty, even when honesty was impolitic, especially then, perhaps. What followed his consolidation of power was, by any measure, an extraordinary period of governance. Caesar moved through the machinery of Roman administration the way he had moved through Gaul, fast, decisive, with an almost irritating clarity about what needed to be done. He founded new colonies to absorb Rome's restless poor and its discharged veterans, planting Roman communities across Carthage, Corinth, and Spain. He pushed through debt relief legislation that stopped short of outright cancellation, enough to ease the pressure on ordinary Romans without triggering a full creditor revolt. He expanded the Senate, which horrified the existing senators, who now had to share their exclusive dining club with provincials and men of lower birth. Some complained that Gauls who barely spoke Latin were now being seated in the Senate House. Caesar was unbothered. He also fixed the calendar. This sounds small. It was not small. The Roman calendar at this point was a magnificent disaster, a lunar system so out of sync with the solar year that months no longer corresponded to seasons. January was sometimes arriving in autumn. Priests and magistrates had been quietly adding intercalary months for years in ways that were occasionally politically motivated, occasionally just incompetent, and almost always confusing. Caesar, with the help of the Egyptian astronomer Sosigenes, reworked the entire system into a 365-day solar calendar with a leap year every 4 years. He had to insert nearly 3 months into 46 BC to correct the accumulated drift, making it the longest year in Roman history, 445 days, known afterward as the Year of Confusion. The irony that Caesar resolved confusion by first making it catastrophically worse was not lost on Romans, but the result endured. The Julian calendar governed the Western world for over 1,500 years. Our own calendar is its direct descendant, adjusted only slightly by Pope Gregory in 1582. Every time someone writes a date, they are, at a distance of 2,000 years, still living inside Caesar's correction. He was also planning bigger things: canals, roads, a massive drainage project for the Pontine marshes, a highway across the Apennines, a campaign east against the Parthians to avenge the catastrophic Roman defeat at Carrhae, where Crassus had died and Rome's eagles had been captured. Caesar had lists. Caesar always had lists. He moved through the world as though time was something that happened to other people, a habit that would prove, in the end, grimly ironic. Through all of this, he practiced what he called clemency. Enemies who surrendered were pardoned. Men who had fought against him, sometimes repeatedly, were given offices, governorships, positions of honor. Brutus, who had sided with Pompey, was made praetor. Cassius, who had despised Caesar openly, was given a praetorship as well. Caesar seemed to genuinely believe that magnanimity would transform enemies into allies, that mercy was not just morally correct but strategically sound. He disbanded his personal bodyguard as a gesture of confidence, or perhaps of philosophy. He wanted to be seen as a man who ruled by consent, not fear. The problem was everything else he was doing. While Caesar practiced clemency in his personnel decisions, he was simultaneously, relentlessly, and perhaps unconsciously dismantling every symbolic mechanism by which Romans had convinced themselves they were free. He sat while the Senate presented him honors rather than standing to receive them, a breach of decorum that senators registered as deeply as a slap. He was granted the right to wear triumphal dress at all public occasions, to sit on a golden chair, to have his image placed among the statues of the gods. A month was renamed in his honor, July Iulius, a name that has outlasted every institution he ever touched. Priests were appointed to maintain his cult as though he were already divine. And then there was the crown. At the festival of the Lupercalia in February of 44 BC, Caesar's ally Mark Antony publicly offered him a diadem, a royal crown, in front of the Roman people. Caesar declined it, once, twice, and the crowd cheered each refusal. But the fact that it had been offered at all, that the gesture was staged, that everyone watching knew it was staged, and that Caesar had not punished Antony for attempting it, this registered. The senators watched and understood that the performance of refusal was still a performance. What Caesar could not bring himself to do in the end was pretend. He had no patience for the elaborate fiction that the Senate still governed Rome, that the consulship still meant what it had meant to Scipio or Cicero, that the Republic was breathing and healthy when everyone in every room already knew it was not. He had won. He governed. The forms remained, but the power had moved, and Caesar refused to spend his energy maintaining the theatrical illusion that it hadn't. This was not stupidity. Caesar was constitutionally incapable of stupidity in political affairs. It was something closer to impatience, or perhaps a philosophical conviction that honesty about power was more stable than pretense. He was wrong about that. The senators who watched Caesar receive his divine honors, who watched the golden chair and the purple robes and the month renamed and the bodyguard dismissed and the pardons handed out to men who were even now sharpening their resentments, those senators were not reassured by the clemency. They were humiliated by it. A pardon, after all, requires an admission that you were defeated. Caesar had made his enemies live inside that defeat every single day, surrounded by his monuments and his titles and his calendar, and had expected gratitude in return. To the men who still believed, or needed to believe, that Rome was a republic governed by law rather than the will of one brilliant, tireless, unkillable man, Caesar had not just become dangerous, he had become intolerable. He had become the thing every Roman schoolboy was taught to fear above all others. The dark figure from the city's oldest nightmares, the tyrant they had overthrown kings to prevent, the word that could not yet be spoken aloud in polite company but that was already being whispered in the corners of the Senate house, in private gardens, in rooms where the wine was good and the doors were closed. Caesar had become in everything but name a king. Chapter 9. The Ides of March. The morning of March 15th, 44 BC arrived the way all catastrophic mornings do, ordinary, unhurried, indifferent to what it was about to permit. Calpurnia had not slept. She had spent the night tangled in dreams violent enough to drag her awake screaming, visions of Caesar's body and blood and the cold marble of the Senate floor. She clutched his arm in the gray pre-dawn and begged him, with a directness that cut through the usual decorum of a Roman wife, to stay home. Not to go, just this once, to let the Senate wait. A soothsayer named Spurina had already warned him weeks earlier to beware the Ides of March, and there had been other signs, or so the city whispered: birds behaving strangely, sacrificed animals found without hearts, a haruspice reading entrails and going pale. Rome in those weeks had been thick with omen-mongers, and Caesar had nodded at all of them with the polite patience of a man who has survived too much to be frightened by augury. He almost stayed home. That part is worth sitting with. According to the ancient sources, Caesar wavered that morning, genuinely unsettled by Calpurnia's distress. He was 55 years old, tired in ways that military victories cannot fix, and whatever else he was not a man who disregarded his wife's terror as trivial. He may have even sent word that he would not attend. Then Decimus Brutus, one of his trusted friends, one of the conspirators he did not yet know was a conspirator, arrived at the house and talked him out of it. "Come," Decimus said in effect, "you cannot let them say Caesar hid from his own Senate because of a woman's nightmare." Caesar got up. He dressed. He went. The theater of Pompeii, where the Senate was meeting while their usual hall was under renovation, would have struck anyone that morning as an unremarkable choice of venue. Spacious, grand, convenient, nobody remarked on the particular irony that the Senate was gathering in a building built by the man Caesar had defeated, beneath a hall dominated by a large statue of Pompey himself, stone eyes watching everything with the serene vacancy of the commemorated dead. Caesar almost certainly noticed. He had a sense of theater and a sense of irony sharper than most. The conspirators called themselves the Liberatores. There were roughly 60 senators who knew what was planned for that day, which is frankly a staggering number of people to keep a secret among, and yet somehow they managed it. They had been meeting, whispering, rehearsing their justifications in the dark for weeks. Marcus Junius Brutus was among them. This is the Brutus, Caesar's friend, a man of such conspicuous moral rectitude that his mere presence in the plot gave it the philosophical cover the others needed. Without Brutus, it was just murder. With Brutus, it could be called principle. Cassius had understood this from the beginning, and had worked on Brutus with the patience of a man who knows exactly which lever to pull. When Caesar arrived at the theater, a man named Artemidorus tried to hand him a written warning, a scroll that named the conspirators and laid out the plan. Caesar took it but didn't read it. He tucked it under his arm where it stayed unread through everything that followed. History has been quietly horrified by this detail for 2,000 years. The senators crowded around him almost immediately. This was not unusual. Petitioners always swarmed Caesar on his way in, pressing requests and grievances close. He would have been accustomed to bodies pressing near, to hands reaching, to voices overlapping. One senator, Tullius Cimber, stepped forward first with a request, ostensibly a petition for his exiled brother's return. Caesar moved to brush past him. Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down from his shoulder. That was the signal. The first blade came from behind, Casca's hand, shaking badly, scratching rather than stabbing at Caesar's neck. Caesar grabbed the arm and turned, demanding in astonishment what Casca thought he was doing. And then the rest came. 60 men, or the fraction of them positioned close enough to reach, a crush of togas and extended arms and flashing iron, and Caesar spinning in the middle of it. He pulled his toga over his face at some point, either to die with dignity or because he couldn't bear to see who else was holding a blade. Both reasons are equally human. 23 wounds. The physician who later examined the body concluded that only one was truly fatal. Ancient sources, and they disagree on much, as ancient sources reliably do, place his last words somewhere in the chaos of those final seconds when Caesar saw Brutus among the men killing him. What he said, if he said anything, has been lost or altered or invented by every generation since. Shakespeare gave him the Latin. Others said he simply stopped fighting when he saw Brutus pulling his toga up and letting go. Whether those last words were accusation, grief, or the punctured disbelief of a man who thought he knew who his friends were, history doesn't know, and perhaps it is better that it doesn't. Some silences are too honest to fill. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue. The senators who had not been part of the plot fled screaming into the streets. The liberatores lifted their bloody hands and called out to the city that Rome was free. The city locked its doors and waited to see what free meant. Caesar lay on the marble with 23 wounds and the unread warning still crumpled somewhere in the folds of his toga, and Pompey's stone face looked down at nothing in particular, as statues do. Outside, Rome was already becoming something different from what it had been that morning, though nobody standing in it could yet have told you what. The man who had crossed the Rubicon, who had wept for Pompey and charmed pirates and refused to kneel to Sulla, who had bent the Roman world so completely toward his own shape that it would never quite unbend, that man was dead at 55, on a perfectly ordinary March morning, killed by friends in a building named for his greatest enemy, precisely where a soothsayer had told him not to be. Chapter 10. The Eternal Name. The assassins left the theater of Pompey convinced they had saved Rome. They were wrong in almost every way a person can be wrong about something. Within hours of Caesar's death, the city they thought they'd liberated was paralyzed by terror. Brutus and Cassius, daggers still metaphorically warm, had no plan for what came next. They had imagined that once the tyrant fell, the Republic would simply exhale and resume, that the old machinery of the Senate would click back into motion, grateful and dignified. Instead, Rome looked at the blood on the floor of that theater and did what it had done so many times before. It panicked, it grieved, it turned on itself. The funeral changed everything. Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal lieutenant, stood before the Roman people and read Caesar's will aloud. Caesar had left his gardens to the public. He had left money to every Roman citizen. He had left, in other words, the impression of a man who had been thinking of ordinary people even at the end. When Antony held up Caesar's toga perforated with stab wounds, the crowd did not quietly reflect on the nature of republican governance. They rioted. They burned the liberatores' houses. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome within weeks. The republic the conspirators had killed Caesar to protect did not bloom in his absence. It simply continued dying, faster now, with more fire. What followed was roughly 13 years of civil war, shifting alliances, and spectacular mutual destruction among the men who claimed Caesar's legacy. Antony and Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted heir, a young man most people initially dismissed as a boy playing at politics, first joined forces to destroy the liberatores. They succeeded. Brutus and Cassius both died at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, and the men who had stabbed Caesar in the name of freedom were gone. Then Antony and Octavian turned on each other, because of course they did. What Octavian lacked in military charisma he made up for in cold patience and an almost preternatural instinct for when to move and when to wait. Antony, entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt, gave Octavian every political gift he could have asked for. The optics of a Roman general gone soft in Eastern luxury, more loyal to a foreign queen than to Rome. Whether that was entirely fair hardly mattered. Octavian used it. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's forces crushed the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Both of them died by their own hands within the year. Octavian stood alone at the top of the Roman world, and here is where the story bends in a way Caesar might have appreciated, maybe even laughed at. Octavian, having won a civil war, having eliminated every rival, having accumulated more raw power than Caesar had ever officially held, took a long, careful look at what had happened to his adoptive father and decided not to be called king. He accepted the title Augustus. He kept the old republican offices and let the Senate perform its rituals. He was, he insisted, merely the first citizen, the princeps, a modest word for a man who controlled the legions, the treasury, and the courts. The senators who had murdered Caesar for reaching too obviously for monarchy now bowed before a monarch who was simply better at pretending otherwise. It worked. Augustus reigned for 40 years and died in his bed. The name Caesar, meanwhile, had already begun its long journey into something larger than one man. Augustus used it as part of his own name since he was Caesar's heir. Every emperor who followed did the same, until Caesar stopped being a name and became a title, the word for supreme power itself. The transformation crept across languages and centuries with remarkable persistence. The Germanic Kaisers took it. The Russian Tsars took it. Across cultures that had never once set foot in Rome, the syllables of a Roman general's family name became synonymous with supreme authority. That is either the most extraordinary accident in the history of language, or the most fitting thing that could possibly have happened to a man who spent his entire life making his name mean something. Beyond the title, Caesar's practical fingerprints remained everywhere. The Julian calendar, the one he reformed with the help of Egyptian astronomers, organized human time for over 16 centuries. When the Gregorian calendar replaced it in 1582, it wasn't so much an overhaul as a slight correction. The basic architecture Caesar built still stood. The concept of a single executive power at the head of a vast administered empire, the model Augustus formalized and every successor inherited, was the political logic Caesar had forced into existence whether Rome was ready for it or not. He had seen what the Republic had become, a system where a handful of wealthy families periodically destroyed each other in the name of collective governance, and he had refused to pretend it was still working. That refusal, not any single battle or reform or affair, was the core act of his life. There is a particular kind of person who looks at the rules of their world and, after genuine consideration, concludes that the rules have become a performance, that everyone is acting out a script which no longer describes reality. Most people, even when they reach that conclusion, keep performing anyway. Caesar stopped performing. He said what he meant, did what he said, and paid the price that Rome had always charged for that particular honesty. He was not a saint. The Gallic campaigns were catastrophic for the people on the receiving end of them. His clemency toward enemies was real, but it also served him, and he knew it. He was vain, he was reckless with money, he could be casually cruel. He was, in other words, a human being in possession of extraordinary gifts and ordinary flaws, placed by ambition and circumstance into a position where both were magnified to an almost absurd degree. But 2,000 years later, when someone stands at a crossroads with everything at risk and decides to move forward anyway, when someone looks at the point of no return and steps across it, they still reach for his image, his moment, his river. The die is cast. 4 words. One small river in northern Italy, an entire civilization's turning point. Julius Caesar did not save the Roman Republic, he ended it, and from its ending built something that outlasted everything he ever planned. His name became a title, his calendar became time itself, and his single moment of irreversible decision became the shorthand for human audacity in every language that followed. Not bad for a man who grew up in a rough neighborhood and died owing a significant amount of money. Not bad at all. One life, one story, infinite lessons. Subscribe, my next one drops soon, and trust me, you'll want to be there.